Chapter 28. The Big Freeze. The remains of the midwinter feast of stewed cabbage, braised eelheads, and spicy onions lay abandoned on the table as Aunt Zelda tried to coax some life into the spluttering fire at Keeper's cottage. The inside of the windows were glazing over with ice, and the temperature in the cottage was plummeting, but still Aunt Zelda could not get the fire going. Bert swallowed her pride and snuggled up to Maxie to keep warm. Everyone else sat wrapped in their quilts, staring at the struggling fire. "Why don't you let me have a go at that fire, Zelda?" Marcia asked crossly. "I don't see why we have to sit here and freeze when all I have to do is this." Marcia clicked her fingers and the fire blazed up in the grate. "You know I don't agree with interfering with the elements, Marcia," said Aunt Zelda sternly. "You wizards have no respect for Mother Nature." "Not when Mother Nature is turning my feet into blocks of ice," Marcia grumbled. "Well, if you wore some sensible boots like I do, instead of prancing around in little purple snaky things, your feet would be fine," Aunt Zelda observed. Marcia ignored her. She sat warming her purple snaky feet by the blazing fire, and noted with some satisfaction that Aunt Zelda had made no attempt to return the fire to Mother Nature's spluttering state. Outside the cottage the north wind howled mournfully. The snow flurries from earlier in the day had thickened, and now the wind brought with it a thick, swirling blizzard that blew in over the moraine marshes and began to cover the land with deep drifts of snow. As the night wore on and Marcia's fire at last began to warm them up, the noise of the wind became muffled by the snowdrifts piling up outside. Soon the inside of the cottage had become full of a soft, snowy silence. The fire burned steadily in the grate, and one by one they all followed Maxie's example and fell asleep. Having successfully buried the cottage up to its roof in snow, the Big Freeze continued its journey. Out over the marshes it traveled, covering the brackish marsh water with a thick white layer of ice, freezing the bogs and quags and sending the marsh creatures burrowing down into the depths of the mires, where the frost could not reach. It swept up the river and spread across the land on either side, burying cow barns and cottages and the occasional sheep. At midnight it arrived at the castle, where all was prepared. During the month before the advent of the Big Freeze, the castle dwellers stockpiled their food, ventured into the forest, and brought back as much wood as they could carry, and spent a fair amount of time knitting and weaving blankets. It was at this time of year that the northern traders would arrive, bringing their supplies of heavy wool cloth, thick Arctic furs, and salted fish, not forgetting the spicy foods that the Wendron witches loved so much. The northern traders had an uncanny instinct for the timing of the Big Freeze, arriving about a month before it was due and leaving just before it set in. The 5 traders who had sat in Sally Mullen's cafe on the night of the fire had been the last ones to leave, and so no one in the castle was at all surprised by the arrival of the Big Freeze. In fact, the general opinion was that it was somewhat late, although the truth was that the last of the northern traders had left a little earlier than they had expected, due to unforeseen circumstances. Silas, as ever, had forgotten that the Big Freeze was due, and had found himself marooned in the hole-in-the-wall tavern after a huge snowdrift blocked the entrance. As he had nowhere else to go anyway, he settled down and decided to make the best of things, while Arthur and a few of the ancients pursued their task of trying to find Simon. The black rat in the rat office, who was awaiting Stanley's return, found himself marooned at the top of the iced-up Eastgate lookout tower. The drain-pipe had filled with water from a burst pipe, and then promptly froze, blocking his way out. The rats in the customer office downstairs left him to it and went home. The supreme custodian was also waiting for Stanley's return. Not only did he want information from the rat, where exactly Marcia Overstrand was, he was also anxiously awaiting the outcome of the message that the rat was to deliver. But nothing happened. From the day the rat was sent, a platoon of fully armed custodian guards was posted at the palace gate, stamping their frozen feet and staring into the blizzard, waiting for the extraordinary wizard to appear. But Marcia did not return. The Big Freeze set in. The supreme custodian, who had spent many hours boasting to Tom Daniel about his brilliant idea of stripping the message rat of his confidential status and sending a false message to Marcia, now did his best to avoid his master. He spent as much time as he could in the ladies' washroom. The supreme custodian was not a superstitious man, but he was not a stupid man either, and it had not escaped his notice that any plans he had discussed while he was in the ladies' washroom had a habit of working out, though he had no idea why. He also enjoyed the comfort of the small stove, but most of all he relished the opportunity to lurk. The Supreme Custodian loved lurking. He had been one of those small boys who was always listening around a corner to other people's conversations, and consequently he was often able to have a hold over someone, and was not afraid to use it to his advantage. It had served him well during his advancement up the ranks of the Custodian Guard, and had played a large part in his appointment as Supreme Custodian. And so, during the big freeze, the Supreme Custodian holed up in the washroom, lit the stove, and lurked with glee, hiding behind the innocent-seeming door with the faded gold lettering, and listening to conversations as people passed by. It was such a pleasure to see the blood drain from their faces, as he jumped out and confronted them with whatever insulting comment they had just made about him. It was even more of a pleasure to call the guard and have them march straight off to the dungeons, especially if they went in for a bit of pleading. The Supreme Custodian liked a bit of pleading. So far he had had 26 people arrested and thrown into the dungeons for making rude comments about him, and it had never crossed his mind even once to wonder why he had yet to hear something nice being said. But the most interesting project that occupied the Supreme Custodian was Simon Heap. Simon had been brought straight from the chapel to the ladies' washroom and chained to a pipe. As Jenna's adopted brother, the Supreme Custodian reckoned he would know where she had gone, and he was looking forward to persuading Simon Heap to tell him. As the big freeze set in, and neither the message rat nor Marcia returned to the castle, Simon languished in the ladies' washroom, constantly questioned about Jenna's whereabouts. At first he was too terrified to talk, but the Supreme Custodian was a subtle man, and he set about gaining Simon's confidence. Whenever he had a spare moment, the unpleasant little man would prance into the washroom and prattle on to Simon about his tedious day, and Simon would listen politely, too scared to speak. After a while, Simon dared to venture a few comments, and the Supreme Custodian seemed delighted to have a reaction from him, and began to bring him extra food and drink. And so Simon relaxed a little, and it was not long before he found himself confiding his desire to be the next extraordinary wizard, and his disappointment with the way that Marcia had fled. It was not, he told the Supreme Custodian, the kind of thing that he would have done. The Supreme Custodian listened approvingly. Here at last was a Heap who made some sense, and when he offered Simon the possibility of an apprenticeship with the new extraordinary wizard, seeing as, and I know this will just remain between you and me, young Simon, the present boy is proving most unsatisfactory, despite our high hopes for him, Simon Heap began to see a new future for himself, a future where he might be respected and be able to use his magical talent, and not be treated merely as one of those wretched Heaps. So late one evening, after the Supreme Custodian had sat down companionably beside him and offered him a hot drink, Simon Heap told him what he wanted to know, that Marcia and Jenna had gone to Aunt Zelda's cottage in the Moram marshes. "And where exactly would that be, lad?" asked the Supreme Custodian with a sharp smile on his face. Simon had to confess he did not know exactly. In a fit of temper, the Supreme Custodian stormed out and went to see the hunter, who listened in silence to the Supreme Custodian ranting on about the stupidity of all Heaps in general, and of Simon Heap in particular. "I mean Gerald," for that was the hunter's name. It was something he liked to keep quiet about, but to his irritation the Supreme Custodian used Gerald at every possible opportunity. "I mean," said the Supreme Custodian indignantly, as he strode up and down the hunter's sparsely furnished room in the barracks, waving his arms dramatically in the air, "how can anyone not know exactly where their aunt lives? How, Gerald, can he visit her if he doesn't know exactly where she lives?" The Supreme Custodian was a dutiful visitor of his numerous aunts, most of whom wished that their nephew did not know exactly where they lived. But Simon had provided enough information for the hunter. As soon as the Supreme Custodian had gone, the hunter set to work with his detailed maps and charts of the Moram marshes, and before long had pinpointed the likely whereabouts of Aunt Zelda's cottage. He was ready once again for the chase. And so, with some trepidation, the hunter went to see Dom Daniel. Dom Daniel was skulking at the top of the wizard tower, passing the big freeze by digging out the old necromancy books that Althor had locked away in a cupboard and summoning his library assistants, 2 short and extremely nasty Magyks. Dom Daniel had found the Magyks after he had jumped from the tower. Normally they lived far below the earth, and consequently bore a close resemblance to huge blind worms, with the addition of long boneless arms. They had no legs, but advanced over the ground on a trail of slime with a caterpillar-like movement, and were surprisingly fast when they wanted to be. The Magyks had no hair, were a yellowish-white color, and appeared to have no eyes. They did, in fact, have one small eye that was also yellowish-white. It lay just above the only features in their face, which were two glistening round holes where a nose should be, and a mouth slit. The slime they extruded was unpleasantly sticky and foul-smelling, although Domdaniel himself found it quite agreeable. Each Magog would probably have been about 4 feet tall if you had stretched it out straight, although that was something no one had ever attempted. There were better ways to fill your days, like scratching your nails down a blackboard or eating a bucket of frog spawn. No one ever touched a Magog unless it was by mistake. Their slime had such a revolting quality to it that just remembering the smell of it was enough to make many people sick on the spot. Magogs hatched underground from larvae left in unsuspecting hibernating animals, such as hedgehogs or dormice. They avoided tortoises, as it was hard for the young Magogs to get out of the shells. Once the first rays of the spring sunshine had warmed the earth, the larva would burst out, consume what was left of the animal, and then burrow deeper into the ground until it reached a Magog chamber. Domdaniel had hundreds of Magog chambers around his hideout in the Badlands, and always had a steady supply. They made superb guards. They could deliver a bite that gave most people rapid blood poisoning and saw them off in a few hours, and a scratch from a Magog's claw would become so infected that it could never heal. But their greatest deterrent was how they looked. Their bulbous yellowish-white head, apparently blind, and their constantly moving little jaw, with its rows of spiked yellow teeth, were gruesome and kept most people at bay. The Magogs had arrived just before the big freeze. They had terrified the apprentice out of his wits, which had given Domdaniel some amusement, and an excuse to leave the boy shivering out on the landing, while he tried yet again to learn the 13 times tables. The Magogs gave the hunter a bit of a shock, too. As he made it to the top of the spiral stairs and strode past the apprentice on the landing, deliberately ignoring the boy, the hunter slipped on the trail of Magog slime that led into Domdaniel's apartment. He just got his balance back in time, but not before he had heard a snigger coming from the apprentice. Before long, the apprentice had a little more to snigger about, for at last Domdaniel was shouting at someone other than him. He listened with delight to his master's angry voice, which traveled extremely well through the heavy purple door. "No, no, no!" Domdaniel was shouting. "You must think I am completely mad to let you go off again on a hunt on your own. You are a bumbling fool, and if there was anyone else I could get to do the job, believe me, I would. You will wait until I tell you to go, and then you will go under my supervision. Don't interrupt! No, I will not listen. Now get out, or would you like one of my Magogs to assist you?" The apprentice watched as the purple door was flung open, and the hunter made a quick exit, skidding over the slime and rattling down the stairs as fast as he could. After that, the apprentice almost managed to learn his 13 times tables. Well, he got up to 13 times 7, which was his best yet. Arthur, who had been busy mixing up Domdaniel's pairs of socks, heard everything. He blew out the fire and followed the hunter out of the tower, where he caused a huge snowfall to drop from the great arch just as the hunter walked under it. It was hours before anyone bothered to dig the hunter out, but that was little consolation to Arthur. Things were not looking good. Deep in the frozen forest, the Wendron witches set out their traps in the hope of catching an unwary wolverine or two to tide them over the lean time ahead. Then they retired to the communal winter cave in the slate quarry, where they burrowed into their furs, told each other stories, and kept a fire burning day and night. The occupants of the treehouse gathered around the wood-burning stove in the big hut and steadily ate their way through Galen's stores of nuts and berries. Sally Mullen huddled into a pile of wolverine furs and quietly mourned her café, while Comfort eating her way through a huge pile of hazelnuts. Sarah and Galen kept the stove going and talked about herbs and potions throughout the long, cold days. The 4 Heap boys made a snow camp down on the forest floor, some distance away from the treehouse, and took to living wild. They trapped and roasted squirrels and anything else they could find, much to Galen's disapproval, but she said nothing. It kept the boys occupied and out of the treehouse, and it also conserved her winter food supplies, which were being rapidly nibbled through by Sally Mullen. Sarah visited the boys every day, and although at first she was worried about them being out on their own in the forest, she was impressed by the network of igloos they built, and noticed that some of the younger Wendron witches had taken to dropping by with small offerings of food and drink. Soon it became rare for Sarah to find her boys without at least 2 or 3 young witches helping them cook a meal, or just sitting around the campfire laughing and telling jokes. It surprised Sarah just how much fending for themselves had changed the boys. They all suddenly seemed so grown up, even the youngest, Jojo, who was still only 13. After a while, Sarah began to feel a bit of an interloper in their camp, but she persisted in visiting them every day, partly to keep an eye on them, and partly because she had developed quite a taste for roast squirrel.